In the winter of 1846, the village of La Prairie did not belong to the world of the living. It was a place of gray shadows and iron-scented mud, tucked away in the damp corners of Normandy. Here, the sky didn't sit above you. It pressed down on you, a heavy slab of granite that seemed to demand the silence of the peasants who lived beneath it. In this village, weight was a virtue. The heavier your plow, the deeper the furrow. The heavier your oak table, the more stable your home. To be light was to be flighty, sinful, or dead. Angelique Cottin was a girl built for this heaviness. At 14, she was a creature of the earth, sturdy, quiet, and almost invisible. She spent her days in the dim light of her family's cottage, her fingers moving in a frantic, learned dance across the threads of a weaving loom. But for weeks, Angelique had been carrying a secret she didn't have the words to name. It wasn't a thought, and it wasn't a feeling. It was a noise, a low-frequency thrumming that started in the soles of her feet and climbed her spine like a colony of biting ants. To Angelique, it felt as though she were being wound up like a clockwork toy, the spring inside her chest tightening until the metal began to scream. January 15th. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the cottage in a twilight of tallow candles and wood smoke. Angelique sat at the great loom with 3 other girls. The air was frigid, yet Angelique was sweating. Her skin felt dry, crackling with a strange, invisible heat. One of the girls whispered that she was shaking the frame. Angelique didn't answer. She couldn't. The hum in her blood had reached a crescendo roar of static that drowned out the wind outside. She reached out her hand to grasp the heavy oak shuttle. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the world broke. The great loom machine that weighed over 500 pounds, a machine that had been rooted in that corner for 3 generations, did not just slide. It revolted. It was as if the earth beneath it had suddenly turned into a spring. With a violence that defied every law of God and Newton, the loom was hurled across the room. It didn't tip. It flew. It struck the stone hearth with the force of a battering ram, the ancient oak splintering into jagged shrapnel. The other girls were thrown back by a concussive wave of air, their chairs skittering away from Angelique as if terrified to be near her. In the center of the wreckage stood Angelique. She was paralyzed, her hand still reaching for a machine that was no longer there. The air around her began to warp. The dust in the room didn't settle. It hovered in a halo around her head. A copper kettle on the stove rattled, then slid across the iron top, falling to the floor with a clang that sounded like a funeral bell. Her mother, Françoise, rushed forward, a cry of possession already forming in her throat. But as she reached out to grab her daughter's shoulder, she was met with something horrific. A jagged blue-white spark, thick as a man's finger, arched from Angelique's skin to her mother's hand. Françoise was thrown into the shadows, her arm numbed, a small blackened burn mark smoking on her thumb. Angelique didn't move. She didn't cry. She only looked at her hands, which were now glowing with a faint, ghostly indigo light in the darkness of the room. This wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a haunting. This was the birth of a phenomenon that science would spend the next year trying to dissect, only to find that there are some things the earth refuses to hold. Angelique Cottin was no longer a girl. She had become a pole in a world that was suddenly the wrong charge. Tonight, we go back to 1846. We look at the logs of the men who tried to measure her, the priests who tried to save her, and the parents who sold her. We look into the void left behind when a human being becomes a lightning bolt. This is the story of the electric girl of La Prairie. The aftermath of the destruction of the loom was not a scene of relief, but one of escalating terror. The Cottin cottage, once a sanctuary of mundane labor, had become a laboratory of the uncanny. Within 48 hours, the hum in Angelique's blood had transitioned from a private torment to a public siege. As the news spread through the frost-bitten lanes of La Prairie, the villagers gathered outside the cottage. They didn't come with soup or blankets. They came with torches and whispered prayers. They looked at the windows of the Cottin house and saw things that shattered their understanding of the natural order. Inside, the laws of gravity had simply ceased to apply to anything Angelique Cottin approached. For Angelique, the horror was biological. Imagine waking up to find that you can no longer touch the world. Every time she tried to sit, the chair was repelled by an invisible force, sliding across the floor as if pushed by a phantom. When she tried to lie down, the bed frame bucked and groaned, its joints screaming under the pressure of a magnetic repulsion so strong it threatened to flip the mattress. She was forced to stand. For hours, for days, she stood in the center of the room, her muscles aching, her feet swollen, because the earth would not let her rest. Whenever her exhaustion became too much and she collapsed toward a wall, the very stones seemed to push back. But the physical isolation was nothing compared to the psychological rot. Angelique's parents, Jean-Pierre and Françoise, were not people of science. They were people of the soil and the pew. To them, a daughter who could throw a loom was not a medical mystery. She was a vessel for the enemy. The neighbors whispered that the girl was a cage for a demon. They watched through the slats in the shutters as Angelique's mother pushed a bowl of porridge toward her, using a 6-foot-long wooden pole. They were afraid to get within her circle. They were afraid that the rot in her blood would jump to theirs. The church arrived in the form of Father Renaud. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, in shadow and light. He arrived with a vial of holy water and a silver crucifix, ready to do battle with the spirit. He stepped into Angelique's radius. Immediately, the air pressure in the room shifted. The candles on the mantel didn't flicker. They leaned away from her, their flames turning a sickly, unnatural blue. As Renaud raised his silver cross to her forehead, the horror truly began. The silver did not touch her. It hit a wall of vibrating air 6 inches from her skin. The priest pushed, his face reddening, his knuckles whitening, but it was like trying to push a needle through solid marble. Then came the spark. A blue arc of energy jumped from the cross to the priest's hand. The silver crucifix began to glow with a dull, cherry-red heat. The iron chain around Renaud's neck sizzled against his skin. He screamed, dropping the holy object, which hissed as it hit the dirt floor. The holy water he had thrown didn't splash Angelique. It turned into a fine, stinging mist that sprayed back into his own face. Renaud fled. He didn't look back. He told the village that the girl was not possessed, she was unmade. He claimed that God had withdrawn his hand from her, leaving her to the mercy of the primordial forces that existed before light was spoken into existence. Left alone with a daughter they could not touch, and a village that wanted to burn their house down, Jean-Pierre and Françoise Cottin felt a shift in their fear. It began to curdle into something even more dangerous: greed. They noticed that while the local priest fled, men of learning began to arrive. These men wore fine coats and carried brass instruments. They didn't speak of demons. They spoke of effluvia and animal magnetism. More importantly, they spoke of the Academy of Sciences in Paris. They spoke of the thousands of francs the elite would pay to see a girl who could defy the earth. Angelique sat in the shadows, her skin glowing with that faint, ghostly St. Elmo's fire, listening to her parents negotiate the price of her misery. She wasn't a girl anymore. She wasn't even a daughter. She was a phenomenon. The anatomy of the curse was complete. The girl who once wove gloves was now a human battery, and the road to Paris was paved with the gold of people who wanted to watch her break. The journey to Paris was not a triumph. It was a transport of terror. Angelique was confined to a carriage that had been modified into a mobile cage, lined with silk and supported by glass insulators to prevent her charge from spooking the horses or shattering the chassis. When they reached the city, the cold, gray walls of the Academy of Sciences loomed over her like a tomb. Here, the superstitious whispers of Normandy were replaced by the cold, calculating eyes of men who saw the world as a machine to be dismantled. This was the beginning of the end for Angelique's humanity. She was led into a vaulted hall where the air smelled of ozone, old parchment, and the metallic tang of brass instruments. At the center sat Francois Arago, a titan of physics, and beside him, the skeletal, sharp-eyed Dr. Dubois. They did not see a terrified 14-year-old girl. They saw a biological anomaly that threatened to upend the laws of Newton. The experiments began with a clinical brutality. They placed her on a heavy wooden platform and surrounded her with galvanometers, delicate needles encased in glass, meant to measure the invisible fluids of the earth. As Angelique approached, the needles didn't just move. They went into a frenzy, spinning so violently that the glass casings exploded, showering the floor with crystal shards. Arago noted that her pulse raced to 120 beats per minute, yet her skin remained as cold as a corpse. They forced her to stand on lead plates and on blocks of resin, trying to ground the force that radiated from her marrow. Each time, the result was the same. The force could not be contained. It was a repulsive energy that seemed to push against the very fabric of space. But the horror was not just in the instruments. It was in the human tests. They brought in a young assistant to hold her hand. The boy approached with trembling fingers. The moment their skin touched, a blue arc of light, thick as a finger, snapped between them. The boy was thrown backward, as if struck by a horse, his muscles locking in a violent seizure that left him gasping on the floor. Dubois, the skeptic, was convinced of a fraud. He subjected Angelique to searches that were nothing short of assault, tearing at her clothes to find hidden magnets or wires, only to find nothing but cold, vibrating flesh. He forced her to sit in a chair while 4 grown men held it steady. With a single breath, the chair and the men were launched across the room, leaving Angelique standing in a vacuum of her own making. As the days turned into weeks, Angelique began to disappear. In the journals of the Academy, she ceased to be a name and became the subject. She was poked with needles to test her reflex under electrical load. She was deprived of sleep to see if the fluid would dissipate with exhaustion. It didn't. Instead, the power became more erratic, more violent. The air around her began to hum with a permanent, low-frequency roar that made her ears bleed. She was a prisoner of her own blood, a girl whose every heartbeat sent a shockwave through the room. She realized then that these men did not want to cure her. They wanted to own the lightning inside her. They were looking for the scalpel of the soul, hoping to cut out the secret of her power and leave the rest of her to rot. She was no longer a child of Normandy. She was a ghost in a brass-bound cage, waiting for the world to either understand her or crush her under its weight. The scientific validation of the Academy had provided a name for her affliction, but it provided no sanctuary. By the spring of 1846, Angelique Cottin was moved from the cold laboratories of the elite to the sweltering, gas-lit theaters of the Boulevard du Temple, the infamous boulevard of crime. Here, the horror was no longer clinical. It was a spectacle. Her parents had fully transitioned from protectors to wardens, seeing the glint of gold in every blue spark that leapt from their daughter's skin. The air in the private salons and public stages was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco, cheap perfume, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that now followed Angelique like a funeral shroud. She was dressed in heavy silks and placed upon a pedestal of glass, a sacrificial lamb offered to the board, aristocrats, and the hungry-eyed voyeurs of Paris. The show was a grotesque pantomime of her suffering. Jean Pierre would stand at the edge of the stage, barking at the crowd like a carnival worker. He invited the strongest men in the room, blacksmiths, soldiers, wrestlers, to try and conquer the electric girl. One by one, they would approach the heavy mahogany chair where Angelique sat, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. They would grip the wood with their massive, calloused hands, vowing to hold her down. But as Angelique's fluid reached its peak, the atmosphere in the theater would change. The audience would feel the hair on their arms stand upright. A low, vibrating growl would fill the room, rattling the crystal chandeliers. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap in a closed box, the chair would revolt. The strong men were not merely pushed. They were catapulted into the front rows, their muscles spasming from a phantom current that left them gasping for air as the weeks dragged on. The power began to mutate into something even more terrifying. It was no longer a simple force of repulsion. It was becoming an atmospheric plague. In the middle of her performances, the candles in the footlights would suddenly lean away from her, their flames turning a ghostly shivering blue before being snuffed out by an invisible vacuum. In the total darkness of the theater, the crowd would scream as they saw blue flames St. Elmo's fire dancing across Angelique's fingertips and crown. She looked like a saint being burned at an invisible stake. People began to whisper that she wasn't just electric. She was a void. They claimed that the air around her felt thin, that it was harder to breathe in her presence, as if she were consuming the very oxygen of the room to fuel the internal storm. The psychological toll was a slow-motion collapse. Angelique was no longer allowed to speak. Her silence added to the mystery her parents were selling. She lived in a world where she could not touch another living thing without causing pain. She watched from the stage as women in the audience fainted, not from the heat, but from the raw, jagged energy she projected. She saw the greed in her father's eyes and the terror in her mother's, and she realized that to them, she was already dead. She was simply a ghost that happened to produce a profit. The boulevard of crime had turned her into a monster for entertainment, a girl trapped in a cage of lightning, while the very earth beneath her feet seemed to be waiting for her to finally, inevitably, shatter into 1,000 pieces of uncharged clay. The end did not come with a scream or a final, blinding flash of light. It began with a hollow, terrifying silence in the center of Angelique's chest. In May of 1846, the internal storm that had ravaged her body for months simply began to dissipate. The transition was not a relief. It was a slow-motion drowning. During a high-stakes exhibition in a crowded Parisian salon, Angelique approached the heavy oak table that had, for months, been her adversary. The audience held its breath, expecting the usual violent eruption of wood and glass. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the surface. The table did not move. It sat with a stubborn, ordinary heaviness. She pressed harder, her face flushing with a desperate, sudden fear, but the fluid was gone. The hum that had lived in her marrow, like a hive of angry bees, had fallen silent, leaving behind an ache so profound it felt as if her bones had been replaced with lead. The reaction from the world was instantaneous and brutal. Her father, Jean-Pierre, did not offer comfort. He offered rage. He accused her of sabotage, of hiding the gift, of destroying the family's fortune out of spite. He shook her, and for the first time in nearly half a year, he could do so without being thrown across the room. The wall was gone, and in its place was a fragile girl who could no longer defend herself. The scientists of the academy returned one last time, but they did not come with wonder. They came with a cold, clinical disappointment. Arago brought his galvanometers and his compasses, but the needles remained paralyzed, pointing stubbornly toward a magnetic north that no longer included Angelique Cottin. They packed their brass instruments into velvet-lined boxes and wrote their final reports, dismissing the entire saga as a temporary nervous derangement or a fleeting hysteria of the blood. To the men of science, she was no longer a phenomenon. She was a broken toy. The return of gravity was a physical agony. For months, Angelique had lived with a sense of buoyancy, a feeling that she was only loosely tethered to the planet. Now, the Earth seemed to demand back everything it had lost. Every step she took felt like wading through deep water. The air, which had once shimmered with her energy, now felt thick and suffocating. She was taken back to the village of Les Prairies, but she was returning to a home that no longer knew her name. The money was gone spent on Parisian hotels, medical fees, and her father's gambling. The cottage was cold. The fire in the hearth stayed lit now, but it provided no warmth to a girl who had once held the lightning. She sat in the corner where the loom had once stood, staring at the scarred floorboards, feeling the crushing weight of the ordinary. The void she left behind in Paris was quickly filled by new sensations. But the void inside Angelique was permanent. She was a ghost of her own history, a woman who had peaked at 14 and spent the rest of her life in the gray shadows of a Normandy winter. The villagers crossed the street when they saw her, not because they feared a shock, but because she reminded them of a miracle that had failed. She was the girl the earth could not hold, and then, with a terrifying finality, the girl the earth had caught. She spent her final years in a silence so deep it was deafening, a human battery that had been drained to the husk, waiting for a spark that would never return. The story of Angelique Cottin did not end in the muddy cemeteries of Normandy. It survived in the yellowing pages of medical journals and the frantic notes of men who tried to quantify the soul. This is the post-mortem of a miracle. In the years following 1846, the case of the electric girl became a foundational ghost story for the burgeoning field of psychology and the fringe sciences of the paranormal. To the medical establishment of the mid-19th century, Angelique was a victim of hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any female behavior that defied the patriarchal order. They claimed her fluid was merely a manifestation of a nervous system under the strain of puberty, a biological short circuit that flared briefly before the dull light of adulthood snuffed it out. They looked for magnets and wires, but what they failed to find was the girl herself. Buried beneath the weight of their instruments. In the decades that followed, a new theory emerged. Early researchers in the field of parapsychology began to see Angelique not as a battery, but as a focus. They noted a recurring pattern in history. Whenever the world records a poltergeist or a shaking house, there is almost always a teenager at the center, someone who's internal. Emotional pressure is so vast, it begins to bleed into the physical world. They suggested that Angelique's power wasn't electricity at all, but a form of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. The horror of her story lies in the idea that the human mind, when pushed to the edge of isolation and grief, can literally warp the space around it. The loom didn't fly because of a current in her blood. It flew because a 14-year-old girl was screaming in a silence so loud it broke the world. The legacy of the girl the earth could not hold is one of tragedy disguised as a wonder. We see it echoed in the magnetic girls of the 1880s and the human batteries of the 1900s, young women who briefly became icons of the impossible before being discarded by a public that had grown bored of their sparks. Angelique's life is a reminder of the era when science and superstition were still locked in a desperate, ugly embrace. It tells us that we have always been obsessed with the idea of more, that there is a hidden potential in our flesh that can defy gravity, outrun time, or shatter stone. But it also warns us of the cost. To be extraordinary in the 19th century was to be a specimen, to be touched only through a glass insulator, and to be loved only as long as you remained a mystery. Today, in the quiet apple orchards of La Prairie, there is no monument to Angelique Cottin. The earth she once repelled has long since reclaimed her, smoothing over the scars where the furniture once danced and the windows once shattered. But on cold, dry nights, when the static in the air makes your skin prickle, and the shadows in the corner of your eye seem to vibrate, some believe the hum hasn't entirely vanished. The story of Angelique remains a haunting static in our history, a reminder that for one brief, terrifying winter, the laws of the universe were suspended for a peasant girl who just wanted to be still. The lightning didn't come from the sky. It came from the heart, and once it was spent, it left a darkness that no gaslight or laboratory could ever truly illuminate. This is the final record of the girl who pushed the world away, and the world that eventually crushed her under its return. Angelique Cottin was the first to show us that the earth does not just pull us down with gravity. It pulls us down with the weight of our own humanity. And in the end, the earth always wins.